Our story begins a very long time ago in a land that was not yet an island. This place, which we now call Britain, was once connected to the rest of Europe by a wide bridge of land. The world was gripped by a great ice age, and enormous sheets of ice, like frozen mountains, covered much of the north. Small groups of early humans, our distant ancestors, walked across this land bridge, following herds of giant animals like mammoths and woolly rhinos. They were hunters and gatherers, constantly on the move, searching for food and shelter in a harsh and unforgiving world. Their lives were a daily struggle for survival against the biting cold and the dangerous beasts that roamed the frozen plains. These early people did not build houses or towns. They lived in caves or temporary shelters made from animal skins and branches, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their existence. Archaeologists have found their simple but effective tools, crafted from sharp pieces of flint stone. These tools were their lifeline, used for hunting, for butchering animals, and for scraping hides to make warm clothing. Imagine, if you will, sitting around a crackling fire in a dark cave, listening to the wind howl outside while chipping away at a piece of flint to create a new spearhead. Every tool was precious, every successful hunt a major victory that meant the group would live to see another day. The climate was not stable. It changed dramatically over thousands of years. Sometimes the ice would retreat and the weather would grow warmer, allowing forests to grow and different animals to appear. During these warmer periods, more people would venture into Britain, but then the cold would return and the massive glaciers would advance again, pushing people and animals south, back towards the warmer parts of Europe. This cycle happened many times. For countless generations, Britain was a land that was visited, abandoned, and then rediscovered. A frontier at the very edge of the human world, its population rising and falling with the rhythm of the ice. The final great retreat of the ice marked a permanent change. Around 10,000 years ago, the world warmed up for good. The colossal ice sheets melted and the water flowed into the seas, causing sea levels to rise dramatically. The low-lying land bridge that had connected Britain to Europe was slowly submerged beneath the waves of what we now call the English Channel. Britain became an island. This was a hugely important moment. From this point on, anyone who wanted to come to Britain would have to cross the sea, making the journey a deliberate and significant act. The people living there were now islanders, their destiny forever shaped by the water that surrounded them. After the ice retreated and Britain became an island, the way people lived began to change in a very big way. For thousands of years, people had been hunter-gatherers, always moving to find their next meal. But then, a new idea arrived from across the sea, an idea that would transform the landscape and society forever: farming. Around 6,000 years ago, newcomers sailed to Britain in simple boats, bringing with them seeds for crops like wheat and barley, and domestic animals like cattle, pigs, and sheep. Instead of hunting for food, people could now grow it. This was a revolution. It meant they could stay in one place, clear forests to create fields, and build more permanent homes. With farming came the first villages. People started to live together in larger, settled communities. They built sturdy houses from timber, wattle, and daub, a mix of woven sticks and clay and thatch. Life was still hard work, filled with ploughing fields, planting seeds, and tending to animals, but it was also more secure. For the first time, people could produce a surplus of food, meaning they could store grain for the winter. This new way of life allowed the population to grow. These early farmers had a deep connection to the land, to the turning of the seasons, and to the cycles of birth, death, and rebirth that they saw in their crops and herds. As these farming communities grew stronger and more organized, they began to build extraordinary things. They weren't just building homes and farms, they were building massive monuments. Across the country, they built long barrows, which were great earthen mounds covering stone tombs where they buried their most important dead. They also created huge circles of earthworks and standing stones known as henges. These places were clearly very special. They must have been centers for the community, places where people gathered for religious ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and to connect with the world of their ancestors and their gods. These monuments show us that these people were thinking about more than just survival. The most famous and mysterious of all these monuments is, of course, Stonehenge. Built on Salisbury Plain over many generations, it is a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering. Just think about it. Without modern technology, these people managed to quarry enormous stones, some weighing as much as a bus, and transport them over vast distances. They then shaped them and lifted them into place with incredible precision, aligning them with the movements of the sun. We don't know exactly why they built it, but it was almost certainly a temple, an astronomical calendar, and a sacred place of immense power. Stonehenge stands today as a silent, awe-inspiring testament to the ambition, skill, and deep spiritual beliefs of Britain's first farmers. Around 2,500 years ago, another wave of change swept across Britain. This was the beginning of the Iron Age, named after a new and powerful metal that people had learned to work with. Iron was much stronger and more common than the bronze that had been used before. With iron, people could make better tools for farming, like stronger ploughs to turn over heavy soil, and more effective weapons such as swords and spearheads. This new technology arrived with groups of people who spread across Europe, people we now call the Celts. They weren't a single, unified nation, but rather a collection of different tribes who shared a similar language, art style, and way of life. The Celtic tribes who settled in Britain are known to us as the Britons. They lived in a landscape dotted with small farming settlements and impressive hill forts. These hill forts were the centers of tribal power, built on high ground and defended by huge earthen banks and deep ditches. Inside the walls were roundhouses, workshops, and storage pits. They were places of refuge in times of war, but also bustling centers of trade and community life. The leaders of these tribes were warrior chiefs and nobles who gained respect through their bravery in battle and their generosity to their followers. It was a society built on loyalty, honor, and a fierce, independent spirit. Further north, in the rugged lands of what would become Scotland, lived other powerful tribes whom the Romans would later call the Picts, meaning the painted people, perhaps because they decorated their bodies with tattoos or war paint. To the west in Ireland were the Gaels. While all these groups were part of the wider Celtic world, they had their own distinct customs and identities. What united them was their culture. They were brilliant metalworkers, creating beautiful and intricate jewelry, mirrors and shields decorated with swirling patterns and fantastical animals. They were also great storytellers, with priests known as druids who memorized ancient laws, histories, and religious poems, passing them down through the generations by word of mouth. The Druids were the intellectual and spiritual leaders of Celtic society. They were more than just priests. They were judges, healers, teachers, and advisors to the chiefs. They held immense power and were respected by all. The Celts worshipped many gods and goddesses who were connected to the natural world, to rivers, forests, the sky, and the sun. They believed in an afterlife and sometimes made offerings to their gods in sacred groves or deep watery pools. This rich and complex culture, with its warrior ethos, stunning art, and deep spiritual connection to the land, defined Britain for centuries, right up until the moment a new, highly organized and unstoppable power appeared on the horizon. For centuries, the Celtic tribes of Britain had lived in relative isolation, their main contact with the continent coming through trade. But across the sea, a mighty empire was growing. Rome. In 55 and 54 BC, the famous Roman general Julius Caesar led 2 expeditions to Britain. These were not full-scale invasions, but more like armed explorations, designed to punish British tribes for helping Rome's enemies in Gaul, modern-day France, and to see what resources the island had to offer. Caesar's legions clashed with the British warriors who fought fiercely from their chariots, but he did not stay. His visits, however, put Britain on the map for the Romans, marking it as a land ripe for conquest. The real invasion came almost a century later. In AD 43, the Emperor Claudius, seeking a glorious military victory to secure his position, ordered a massive invasion force to cross the Channel. 4 legions, around 40,000 professional soldiers, landed on the coast of Kent. The Roman army was the most formidable fighting machine of its time. Unlike the Celtic tribes, who fought with individual bravery, the Romans fought as a single, disciplined unit. With their organized tactics, superior armor, and deadly short swords, they systematically crushed the resistance of the southern British tribes, pushing relentlessly inland and establishing a new province they called Britannia. As the Romans advanced, they built forts and established a network of famously straight roads to help move their troops and supplies quickly around the country. These roads connected new towns that they founded, which were unlike anything Britain had seen before. Towns like Londinium, London Camulodunum, which is Colchester, and Verulamium, now St Albans, were laid out in a neat grid pattern with public buildings like forums for government, basilicas for law courts, and public bathhouses for socializing and relaxing. These towns became the centers of Roman power and culture, attracting traders, officials, and settlers from all over the empire. But not all Britons accepted Roman rule quietly. In AD 60, a rebellion erupted that almost drove the Romans out of the island. It was led by Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe. After her husband died, the Romans betrayed an agreement, flogged Boudica, and assaulted her daughters. Enraged and humiliated, Boudica united several tribes and led a furious army on a path of revenge. They burned the new Roman towns of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium to the ground, slaughtering thousands. For a moment it seemed Boudica would succeed, but she was eventually defeated by a much smaller but better disciplined Roman army. Her rebellion was crushed, but her story has lived on as a powerful symbol of the fight for freedom. After Boudica's rebellion was brutally put down, Roman control over the southern half of Britain became secure. For the next 300 years, this part of the island was a peaceful and prosperous province of the vast Roman Empire. The Romans never fully conquered the rugged highlands of Scotland. They eventually built Hadrian's Wall, a massive stone fortification that stretched from coast to coast to mark the northern frontier of their empire and keep the unconquered Pictish tribes out. Life south of the wall, however, was transformed. The old Celtic tribal territories were reorganized into administrative districts, and a new Romano-British culture began to emerge. Many wealthy British landowners embraced the Roman way of life. They built magnificent countryside homes called villas, which were a world away from the simple round houses of their ancestors. These villas were large, comfortable buildings with multiple rooms, decorated with beautiful mosaic floors and painted plaster walls. They often had their own bathhouses, central heating systems called hypocausts, and were at the center of large farming estates that produced grain, wool, and other goods for sale in the towns and for the army. For the elite, life in Britannia meant enjoying the comforts, luxuries, and opportunities that came with being part of the Roman world. While the rich lived in luxury, most people in Britannia were still ordinary farmers working the land, much as their ancestors had done. However, Roman rule brought significant changes for everyone. The network of Roman roads made travel and trade easier and safer than ever before. A single currency was used throughout the province, and a system of Roman law provided a new way of settling disputes. Latin became the language of government, business, and the army, and many Britons, especially in the towns and among the upper classes, learned to speak and write it. This created a shared culture that blended old Celtic traditions with new Roman ideas. Towards the later part of Roman rule, a new religion began to spread across the empire: Christianity. It arrived in Britain through soldiers, traders, and missionaries. At first, it was just one of many religions, and its followers were sometimes persecuted. But in the 4th century, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and it began to take root more firmly in Britain. Churches were built in towns, and Christian symbols started to appear on objects in villas. The arrival of Christianity was one of the most enduring legacies of the Roman period, a seed that would survive the collapse of the empire and grow to shape the future of the island in profound ways. By the late 4th century, the mighty Roman Empire was in serious trouble. It was facing enormous problems on many fronts. Barbarian tribes were pressing on its borders in Europe, civil wars were becoming more frequent, and its economy was weakening. The empire was overstretched and struggling to pay for its huge army. To defend other, more vital parts of the empire, like Gaul and Italy, Roman leaders began to withdraw legions from Britain. The province, which had relied on the Roman army for protection for over 300 years, was becoming increasingly vulnerable. The great shield that had kept Britannia safe was slowly being lowered. The people of Britannia started to see signs of this decline. The towns, once bustling centers of commerce, began to shrink. Fewer grand new buildings were constructed and some public spaces fell into disrepair. The economy suffered as trade with the rest of the empire slowed down. Coins became scarcer and people returned to a system of barter. At the same time, raids from outside the province were increasing. Picts from the north swarmed over Hadrian's Wall. Scots, who were actually Gaels from Ireland, attacked the western coasts, and new enemies began to appear from across the North Sea, the Saxons. The final break came in the year AD 410. The Roman Emperor Honorius, facing an invasion of Italy itself, sent a famous message to the leaders of Britannia. He told them that they could no longer expect help from Rome and that they must now look to their own defences. This was a devastating blow. The Roman legions departed for good, and the province was officially cut off from the empire. The salaries for Roman officials and soldiers stopped, and the entire structure of Roman government in Britain collapsed. After nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule, the people of Britannia were suddenly on their own. What followed was a period of chaos and uncertainty, often called a Dark Age because so few written records survive from this time. The Romano-British leaders, who were essentially local warlords, struggled to maintain order. They tried to defend their territories against the raiders, but without the organization and discipline of the Roman army, it was an impossible task. The roads fell into disrepair, the towns were largely abandoned, and society fractured back into small competing kingdoms. The sophisticated, interconnected world of Roman Britain faded away, and the island entered a new, violent and transformative chapter of its history. With the Roman legions gone, Britannia was a tempting target. The local Romano-British leaders needed soldiers to defend their lands, and they followed a risky Roman practice. They hired mercenaries. They invited warriors from tribes across the North Sea, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, who came from areas in modern-day Germany and Denmark, to fight for them in exchange for land and payment. These newcomers were fierce, skilled pagan warriors who came in their longships, seeking new opportunities and new lands to settle. At first they served as protectors, but soon they saw the weakness of their employers and the richness of the land. The deal quickly turned sour. According to tradition, the Anglo-Saxon mercenaries rebelled against their British hosts, complaining about their pay and provisions. This rebellion sparked a long and brutal period of conflict. More and more warriors and their families began to cross the sea, not as mercenaries anymore, but as invaders and settlers. They fought their way inland, pushing the native Britons steadily westwards into the mountains of Wales, the northern region of Cumbria, and the southwestern peninsula of Cornwall. The Britons fought back bravely, and legends from this time speak of a great British war leader, perhaps the man who inspired the stories of King Arthur, who won a major victory and temporarily halted the Saxon advance. But the tide of history was against the Britons. Over the next century and a half, the Anglo-Saxon newcomers established a firm grip on the richest part of the island, the lowlands of the south and east. The land that was once the Roman province of Britannia began to change its name. The Anglo-Saxons started to call it Angleland, which would eventually become England. The invaders were not a single united force, but were made up of different groups who established their own separate kingdoms. Over time, several powerful kingdoms emerged, including Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south. These new kingdoms were very different from Roman Britain. The Anglo-Saxons did not care for the stone cities and villas of the Romans, which they left to fall into ruin. They were a rural people, living in small villages of wooden halls and farmsteads. Their society was organized around loyalty to a lord or king who was expected to be a brave warrior and a generous giver of gifts. They brought with them their own language, their own laws, and their own gods. Powerful deities like Woden, the god of war and wisdom, and Thor, the god of thunder. A completely new culture was being planted in the soil of Britain. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons brought about one of the most fundamental changes in British history, the transformation of its language. The Latin and Celtic languages spoken in Roman Britain were almost completely replaced in the areas the newcomers settled. The Anglo-Saxons spoke their own Germanic dialects, which mixed together over time to form what we now call Old English. This is the direct ancestor of the English language we speak today. Simple, everyday words like house, man, woman, bread and water all come from Old English. The names of many English towns and villages, especially those ending in ham for homestead, tun for settlement, or ing meaning people of, are a map of this Anglo-Saxon settlement. The laws and social structure also changed dramatically. Roman law, with its written codes and formal courts, disappeared. In its place, the Anglo-Saxons brought their own system of customary law, which was passed down by the word of mouth. Justice was based on oaths and loyalty. If someone was accused of a crime, they could be supported by oath helpers who would swear to their innocence. If a person was killed or injured, the matter was often settled not by imprisonment, but by paying a compensation payment to the victim's family, known as the wergild or man price. The value of the wergild depended on a person's social rank. A nobleman was worth far more than a peasant. Religion was another area of profound change. The Anglo-Saxons were pagans who worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses linked to nature, warfare and fate. They did not believe in the Christian God. However, the Christianity that had taken root in Roman Britain had not been completely wiped out. It survived in the unconquered Celtic kingdoms of the west and north, and especially in Ireland, which became a great centre of Christian learning. At the end of the 6th century, a new mission began to bring Christianity back to the Anglo-Saxons, this time arriving directly from Rome. In AD 597, a monk named Augustine was sent by the Pope to convert the Anglo-Saxons. He landed in Kent and successfully converted its king, Ethelbert. At the same time, Irish monks from the north, like St. Aidan, began spreading their Celtic form of Christianity in the Kingdom of Northumbria. For a time, these two different traditions of Christianity, the Roman and the Celtic, competed for influence. Eventually, the Roman version became dominant, but the reconversion of England was a slow process that took many decades. The new faith brought with it writing, learning, and new connections to the wider European world, slowly stitching the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms back into the fabric of Christendom. The centuries following the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons were a time of constant struggle and slow consolidation. The separate kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex and Kent, were often at war with each other, each vying for supremacy. Powerful kings known as Bretwalders or Briton rulers would sometimes dominate their neighbours, creating temporary empires. But no single kingdom was able to establish permanent control over the whole of what was now England. This was a land of competing kings, warrior loyalties and shifting borders, a patchwork of rival powers rather than a single, unified nation. Despite the political divisions, a common identity began to form. The shared Anglo-Saxon language, Old English, and the gradual adoption of a single Christian faith created powerful cultural bonds that crossed the borders of the individual kingdoms. Monasteries became great centres of learning and art, producing beautiful illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels and scholarly works like those of the Venerable Bede, who wrote the first history of the English people. This growing sense of a shared English identity, distinct from the Britons in the west and the Picts in the north, was a crucial development. The idea of England was beginning to take shape. The foundations laid during this long and often turbulent period were deep and enduring. The language, the basic patterns of settlement in villages and shires, counties, the legal traditions and the Christian faith all have their roots in this era. The struggles and achievements of these early peoples, from the first Ice Age hunters to the Roman soldiers, and from the Celtic tribes to the Anglo-Saxon kings, all contributed to the complex character of the island. Each group left its mark on the landscape, the culture and the very DNA of the people who would come to call themselves British and English. This long saga of settlement and transformation set the stage for the next great challenge. Just as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were becoming more established and sophisticated, a new and terrifying threat appeared from across the sea. From the late 8th century onwards, fearsome raiders in longships began to attack the coasts of Britain. They came from Scandinavia and were known as the Vikings. Their arrival would unleash a new storm of violence and invasion, testing the newly forged English identity to its limits and starting yet another dramatic chapter in the island's ancient saga. The story was far from over.